episode of Ask on CYC. So as you're probably aware, today's episode is about property, whether you want to rent, buy, invest or sell. So I have something very special for you today. For the privileged audience members who tune in live, I'm going to give you the opportunity to get free legal advice on conveyancing matters. And all you other viewers who are probably watching this later on YouTube, probably saying, oh, I should have tuned in live because I got some advice. I want some advice on buying, selling, renting or investing. So I'd like to introduce you to today's guest, Solicitor Mina Hanna. Welcome, Mina.
Thanks, man. It's good to be here.
It's a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you.
So Mina, in your line of work, you're a solicitor, so you deal with a lot of conveyancing matters.
Yes.
Am I correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So, but it's not as simple as one thinks it is, just to go and buy and that's it. There's a lot to it. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's right. So conveyancing is a technical area of the law. So you've got solicitors who do the conveyancing. You also have specialised conveyancers who do the conveyancing for you. And there's a lot of things that you need to look out for when you're buying a property. So when you're looking at purchasing a property, you need to be able to, before you go in and put an offer and sign the contract, you need to get a solicitor to have a look at the contract for you to make sure that it has the terms in there that can protect you and there are no nasty surprises inside that contract.
Okay. Just a reminder to our viewers, so if you want free legal advice today, please, the phone number is 0416 551 292. Text in your question, or if you're courageous enough, give us a call and speak to our solicitor that's live tonight. So, Mina, I want to give you a hypothetical situation. So, a couple just got married, newlyweds, and they just got an average income, and they just finished off paying a wedding. But buying property now, they think about buying property, but the market is crazy right now, as we're seeing in Sydney. So what should one consider to help with decision making in this scenario?
Yeah, look, the property prices in Australia, as you said, are quite high at the moment. So the latest statistics show that median house prices in Sydney, for example, they've reached the $1 million mark and they're increasing by $2,000 a week. So for newlyweds that have just got married and looking for buying a property, the considerations are quite high in terms of finances. Now, if you've just paid off an expensive wedding, my advice would be, before you even enter into the wedding phase, it's probably important to take a step back and factor in the price of a house or a new property with your wedding expenses. So what we're increasingly finding now at work is a lot of people will spend a lot of money on their wedding. Hands down. I think the average price now for weddings is between $50,000 to $70,000. Look at property prices in context. When you come to buy a property, the biggest hurdle for a newlywed or for a first home buyer is the deposit. So usually vendors will require that you pay at least a 10% deposit. So on the example that I've given for a house, average price $1 million, you're looking at a $100,000 deposit just to get your foot in the door. On top of that, you need to have the stamp duty ready. The stamp duty is roughly about 3% of the purchase price. In this case, it would be another $30,000. So just to get off the ground and find a property and be ready to buy, you need to have about $130,000 to hand. Now, our Australian Treasurer yesterday came out and gave some really useful advice, which was, if you want to buy a property, get a better paying job. Now, funnily enough, he is right in a way, although he probably could have put it better. I think what young couples need to remember as well is that gone are the days where we can say the Australian dream is a quarter-acre block with a picket fence and a nice front door. I mean, that's not going to be the first step into the property market anymore. The property market now, you're more likely to enter the property market buying a smaller apartment and then later on in life upgrading to a semi or maybe to a house thereafter. So unit prices in Sydney, for example, the median price for a unit in Sydney is probably around the $700,000 to $800,000. It's slightly cheaper, and that's probably where they need to pitch their expectations early on.
Okay, with this scenario, would you say renting would be the safer option, or generally speaking, is renting the safer option?
Look, I don't know whether renting's a safer option, but it is an option. So obviously, if you can't afford to get into the market, given how hot it is at the moment, then you would have to rent. Renting, again, in this current market is quite difficult. unfortunately, in the Sydney market, we're also hot in the renting market. So the average rental asking price is about $530 a week. The good thing about renting is that you don't need a deposit, you don't need to pay the stamp duty. All you're paying is the weekly or the monthly rent as they fall due. And we're lucky here in Australia that there's a lot of legislation which protects renters from landlords, and there's a lot of legislation which ensures that the property that you're living in is habitable, fit for its purpose, and that you have quiet enjoyment of that property. So renting is an option before heading into the property market.
Sure. You mentioned stamp duty. What is stamp duty and how much % is it?
Look, stamp duty is what we pay for the privilege of buying a property. We pay that to the state governments, and it's a tax. Essentially, it's a tax. It is a stepped system, so roughly I would say it's about 3% all up. In New South Wales, there is an exemption for stamp duty if you're a first home buyer and you're buying a brand new property that's never been lived in. So that's the only exemption that we've got at the moment in New South Wales.
Okay. I've got another hypothetical for you. So a lot of couples, before they get married, they buy property and they spend some money, refurb it, make it look good, even rent it out. So by the time the big day comes, they have a property ready to move into. But we can't predict the future. Only God can. So we don't know whether this couple is going to last together up until the wedding day or not. So let's say the couple, hypothetically, break up before the wedding. So what are the obstacles are they looking at to get this property offloaded?
Yeah, look, a relationship breakdown is always going to be a fairly emotional time for couples, especially if they're looking forward to getting married, they bought a property together. If they're rational and if the breakup is fairly amicable and they're fairly mature about the whole process, then the right thing to do would be to relist the property back on the market. And also before you go into the situation where you're buying property, you should probably record what you've put into the purchase. So if one partner's put in the deposit, the other partner's put in the stamp duty, you need to record that. So in the event that the relationship does break down, you can sell the property and equally distribute according to what they put in. If they're being rational, yes, sell the property, ensure that you're still making the mortgage repayments, you're still making payments to cover water and council and whatever other bills that there are. And then when you sell it, you divide the profits or the losses equally between the parties in the proportion that they put it in. That's a great scenario. That's a scenario we'd love to see more often, actually.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think what happens in cases where there is a breakdown in a relationship during the engagement is that both parties refuse, or at least one of the parties or both parties will refuse to pay the mortgage, refuse to pay the outgoings, and they don't realise the consequence of that is that the bank will chase them. They'll end up with a bad credit rating, and it gets a bit more complicated. Excuse me. Even more complicated is when one of the parents have gone as a guarantor to the loan. So a parent, in this day and age, given the prices of property as they are, parents try and help by guaranteeing a loan. So you guarantee a bank that if my son or my daughter cannot make the repayments, I'll jump in and I'll make the repayments for them. So in situations where they're being fairly emotional and they're refusing to pay, it's usually the parents that end up having to pay. So it's a very sensitive situation, but I'd hope in situations like this that people would take the rational approach and just sell it and move on fairly quickly and amicably. Okay.
So when a person sells a property, they have to pay this capital gains tax. So what is capital gains?
Capital gains is another tax. We're a heavily taxed country, unfortunately. So you're taxed as you buy, you're taxed as you sell.
Yeah.
There are exemptions to paying capital gains tax. So capital gains tax essentially is paying tax on the difference between what you've bought the property for and what you've sold the property for. There are exemptions. If it's your own house, your principal place of residence, then you're exempt. You don't pay the capital gains tax. If it's an investment property that you've held for over a year, you get what's called a 50% discount on the capital gains tax that you pay. But essentially it is another tax that you need to factor in when you're selling your property.
Sure. So you're saying if it's an investment for just over a year, you pay the 50%. When does it become where you can get exempt completely if it's an investment, not your home?
Generally, you don't get exempted if it's an investment. So if it's an investment, you're always going to pay a level of capital gains tax. I mean, you'd need to speak to your accountant. There are certain exemptions and ways you can structure it so you can limit the amount of capital gains tax you pay. But unless it's your principal place of residence, you're not really going to receive an exemption for that sale.
Okay. Look, we're going to go for a quick break. When we come back, we'll continue our discussion.
Great.
So we're going to go for a quick break. Remember, the phone number is 0416 551 292. Tonight, you have an opportunity to get free legal advice. So if you're thinking about buying, selling, renting, or investing, please call up or even just send a text and ask our solicitor on our tonight's live show. Thank you.
CYC, Christian Youth Channel.
Welcome back to Ask, and tonight's episode we're talking about buying, renting, selling, investing. So if you have a question, we're giving out free legal advice. So the phone number is 0416 551 292. Please send us a text, or if you're courageous enough, give us a call and speak to our solicitor on tonight's live show. So welcome back, Mina.
Thank you.
So Mina, let's get back straight into the topic. Negative gearing. I've been hearing it a lot. And what is negative gearing, and how can one use it and utilise its advantages?
Negative gearing is very unique to Australia. I don't think there's any country around the world that has this concept of negative gearing. And essentially what it means is if you have an investment property, you can offset the income that you receive from that property with the interest that you pay and the expenses that you pay in maintaining that property. So essentially it's a tax benefit for the person who owns that investment property. In Australia, there's been a lot of debate about whether you keep negative gearing or remove it. There is a lot of argument that by having this negative gearing system, we're actually pushing up prices in Australia because people are going out buying investment properties to offset their income for tax purposes. Whether that's true or not, I'm not sure, but I think Australia is very unique in having this system.
Okay. A lot of people nowadays, because the prices are expensive, they can't go solo, so what they do is they get into a partnership. So if one does want to go into a partnership, what are the precautions they should take before entering into a partnership or investing with another party?
Partnerships are quite interesting and they're quite challenging, and people throw around the concept of a partnership as if it's fairly simple and easy. There are a few pitfalls in partnerships. The first thing is you really need to know who your partner is before you go in with them. So you need to go into you need to partner up with someone that you can trust, someone that you know very well, someone that you can work with. So in a partnership, when you're going into business, there's always going to be a hard decision to make. There's always going to be a decision as to what you're going to do and how you're going to carry it out. And if between you and your partner you're not agreeing, there's always conflict, there's dispute, then the partnership is never going to work. So the first thing in entering into a partnership is make sure you have a partner that you know well and you know who you can work with. The second thing in a partnership, and people tend to ignore the second part because it costs money. The second part is you need to go to a solicitor and draw up a partnership agreement. The partnership agreement is generally overlooked because people say, look, I'm good friends with my partner. I don't need to have a partnership agreement. We understand each other well and that's fine. But what we've seen lately is a lot of partnerships end up being dissolved after about 12 months of business. Because once money comes involved in a relationship, things change. So you need to have a partnership agreement. The partnership agreement essentially dictates who's each person's right in the actual partnership, what happens when things are going well, how decisions are made, how conflicts are resolved, and what happens if each party wants to pull out of the partnership. So essentially it steps out what happens in good times and what happens in bad times. And a good partnership agreement would limit the scope for disputes in the future. So that's why I think a lot of people overlook this important aspect. It's a small aspect, but it's important. Before you do anything, go to a solicitor and get a partnership agreement drawn up. The third thing that you'd want to consider when going into a partnership to purchase property, in this case, I think you go into partnership to purchase property when it's a commercial venture. So you need to consider what vehicle you want to purchase the property in. So there are a few options. You can either purchase property in your own name, so between you and your partner, you can purchase property. You can purchase property as a company, so you can set up a company, what we call in Australia a PTY Ltd company. It's a company limited by guarantee. And this is fairly unique, well, it's not unique, but it's becoming more popular, is the option of a family trust purchasing property. So when you come to purchase property, depending on what you're going to do with the property, you need to consider what's the best legal vehicle for you to employ. And in making that decision, you also need to speak to the banks, because banks have different requirements depending on what vehicle you purchase the property in.
Sure.
Once you do that, so you've covered the 3 simple steps. They're not really simple, they take a lot of time to get through. Then you're in the market looking for the property. And when you're looking for a commercial property, there are a lot of things you've got to look out for. So commercial property needs to be suited for the purpose that you need it to do. So if you want to build apartments, you need to make sure that the local council zoning laws allow you to build apartments. If you want to build duplexes, if you want to build semis, if you want to build a large house on it, if you want to build a factory, you need to make sure that the local council has zoned that particular area to allow you to do that. And the best way to do that, it's in the contract.
Okay.
So that you give that contract to your solicitor will go through it. There's something called a Section 149 certificate, which each council issues. And that's a really important document. People don't like to read it, but it's one of the most important documents in the contract. It tells you the zoning for the property. It tells you whether council have a plan to widen the road and take part of your land. It tells you whether the land is contaminated. It tells you all kinds of interesting facts and actually guides your decision as to whether you should go ahead and purchase a particular property.
Okay.
So it's all about homework.
I think a lot of people underestimate the help that they can get from a solicitor, thinking I can do it on my own, I'm good with admin work, I'm good with, reading contracts. So a lot of people, I think, underestimate the help that they can get from speaking to a solicitor.
Yeah, look, there's a misconception that you only go to a lawyer when you're in trouble. I got a speeding fine, I got a parking fine, I want to get out of a particular payment. But solicitors are also there to help you. So they're also there to guide you when you're making important decisions, especially around the purchase of property.
Okay. I've got a couple of questions that came in from our audience. So the first question that came through is, many prospective first home buyers have a good job, though still cannot get into the Sydney market. What are your comments on this? I remember I read one time the 10 most expensive cities in the world, and I think Sydney 7 or something.
Yeah, we always seem to be in the top 10, top 5. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I think it's last time when I saw it, but I hear that these days it's moved up to 4, 3, something like that.
Yeah. It is ridiculous. Look, in answering that question, the Australian Treasurer Joe Hockey answered that question yesterday, and he said, "Go get yourself a better paying job," which is not useful. But I think we alluded to the answer to this earlier on. I think it's important to understand that we don't need to enter the market now at the top end. We don't need to go straight into a house and live the Australian dream on day one. We need to enter the market at a point which is comfortable for us. So you don't really want to overstretch yourself and find that you're struggling under the burden of a mortgage. So if that means you go to an apartment is a home as well. Start your first purchase in an apartment. If it's not in the area that you want and you need to move further out from the CBD to get a cheaper apartment, then so be it. But I think the most important thing for a first home buyer or a prospective home buyer is that you need to find the right property at the right price, which is not necessarily going to be in the right area that you want. Put your foot in the market, and then you'll find that this property will grow in value. You never know, in future you'll get a better job, you can sell the unit and then move on to better projects.
Yeah. Okay. Second question that came in is, what's the difference between joint tenants and tenants in common? And which one is better for the married couples?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Look, a joint tenant is where both parties own the property equally. So you're both 100% owners. What that means is that if probably a bad example, but I'll say it anyway, is that if one member was to pass away, the other person automatically takes ownership of 100% of the property.
100%, yeah.
So the joint tenants is usually the favoured approach. It's actually the default approach on the contract. So if you don't actually tick that it's going to be a joint tenant or a tenant in common or an equal shares, the default position is you've bought it as a joint tenant. So you both buy it as 100%. Tenants in common is also common where you buy a property perhaps with a friend or with your sibling or with your parent, and you've put in a certain percent as a deposit, they've put in a certain percent in the deposit, and you can dictate what percentage of the property each person owns. So you can say, person A owns 30% of the property, person B owns 70% of the property. There are a few reasons why you do that. A, it depends on the proportion that you've put forward, or it can be for tax purposes as well.
Sure. And also when you get into partnerships.
And when you get into partnerships as well, you can actually dictate the percentage under the tenants in common approach.
So this goes well, for example, God forbid one of the partner dies, passes away. If they tick the first option, then the second partner would get 100% of the property.
Correct.
Whereas if they tick the
tenants in common approach,
the family of the past member gets the...
Correct. And I think you've just touched on an important issue there, which is when you are buying property, and if you are a property owner, it's important to have a will. So if something does happen to you, then you actually have dictated in advance where that property is to go. So in the example that you've just given, tenants in common, one of the members were to pass away, they have a 30% earning or a holding in the property, then the will should actually stipulate that the 30% ownership of the property in X goes to, my son, my brother, my sister, whoever else.
And then there's no will?
It gets a bit more technical.
Okay. All right. Look, let's have a chat about auctions. I remember the first time I went to an auction, it was the scariest day of my life. 50, 60 auctions later, it's probably still the scariest day of my life.
yeah, that's right.
So what can a person do, or what advice would you give to someone who's going into an auction?
The first piece of advice that I give to a client when they walk in and say, I'm going to an auction on Saturday, is you need to be aware that at auction, which is different to when you're buying a house for sale, once the hammer comes down at the auction, you must complete the contract. There is no cooling off period. You can't say after the auction, after you've won the auction, I've changed my mind. There is no recourse to change your mind. If you are the winning bidder at an auction, you must proceed to settlement. You can't pull out. It's yours. And that's something that a lot of people don't realise. A lot of people go to auctions and put up their hand, win. I had a situation recently where a client went to an auction without consulting a solicitor. She put up her hand, she won the auction. She came to the office on Monday morning and she said, I've changed my mind. I don't want it. And I said to her, it's too late. It's yours. So you've got to be very careful at an auction. What that means, working backwards, is you shouldn't be going to an auction unless your finance has been approved for a particular amount. You've checked out the property, you've undertaken searches as to, you can undertake building reports to see whether the building is stable, whether there are any problems with the building, undertake a pest inspection report to make sure there are no termites eating the house, eating parts of the house. You can also undertake a survey of the actual land to make sure that the boundaries are in the correct place and there's no irregularities in the boundaries. You need to make sure that you've done your homework. So really, my advice to my clients usually is don't go to an auction unless you're ready to buy. Because if you are the winning bidder at the end of the day, rain, hail or shine, you have to purchase. Interestingly, I did have another client who went to an auction. He actually just happened to walk past. He hadn't really registered. He started bidding. He won. And he said to himself, this is a great development site, big corner block. And so he came to me on Monday morning and said, hey, good news, I've bought a property. And I'm going to knock it down, I'm going to build units. And I had a look at the contract, and the first thing it said on the contract, this is a heritage listed home, which means you cannot knock it down.
Oh, wow. Oh.
So he was fairly shocked at that. But this is an example of when you go to an auction, you've just got to be really, really careful. You have to be confident that it's yours. And the final advice I'd give for auctions is do not get caught up in the hype. Yeah, many times you've set a limit and you get so excited because everyone's bidding that you just keep going over your limit. You just need to understand when you need to stop.
You bid with emotion, not with your mind.
Correct, that's right. And you don't bid with your wallet either.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's all right. I remember I went to an auction with a friend one time, and they didn't win. They were second runner-up from the winner, and it was a great property, and we were excited, and we kept pushing up, even past what his wallet told him to stop at, And about a week later, he got a phone call from the real estate saying, "Oh, the guy's loan didn't go through. Take the property, it's yours." Wait a sec, this guy's a big developer. We've seen him around, as if this guy's loan didn't go through. So we did our research. I went into the council and found out that there was an easement, and that this land couldn't be demolished because of the stormwater running through. So the real estate kept coming back and begging him, "Oh, whatever price you want, come take it. Whatever you want, come take it." And so after we did our research, we found out, no, we can't go ahead with this. So.
Exactly. And the law in Australia is buyer beware. You've got to do your homework. You've got to make sure 100% that this is exactly what you've wanted. And looking at sewage, looking at easements, looking at terms in the contract, all those things together will help inform your decision as to whether this is the property for you.
Sure. Look, you mentioned earlier about the cooling off period. What is the cooling off period? And when does it officially start and end?
So the cooling off period is the period from the time that you sign the contract, which we call an exchange of contracts, to the time where it becomes binding on you. So we're not talking about auction situations, because in auctions there is no cooling off. So if you're interested in a property, the real estate agent says to you, "Listen, if you don't sign today, I have someone coming in tomorrow who will take it." You haven't done your homework, you haven't done your building report, your pest report, you haven't spoken to your bank. Potentially you can sign and exchange the contract. And you only really need to provide 0.25% of the purchase price as a deposit. During the 5 business days, so it has to be 5 business days cooling off, you can do all your searches. Speak to the bank, can you afford it? Yes. Pest report, building report, survey, fine, yes. Then you might say, fine, I'll go ahead with it. And during that cooling off period, you can also negotiate the terms of the contract. So if you want an extended settlement period, you can ask for it. If you want to pay a smaller deposit up front, you can ask for that as well. So really, it's 5 working days, which allows you some breathing space to do your work without someone coming in and gazumping you on the contract. If you decide, I don't want the property after 5 days, then you have the option to pull out, but you lose the 0.25% of the purchase price that you put down, which is generally not a large amount.
Is this during the 5 days or after?
No, you have to pull out before the 5 days.
Before the 5 days. But if you pull out after?
You can't pull out after. So after the cooling off period ends, after 5 p.m. on the 5th day, 5th business day, the contract becomes final.
Okay, so what happens when a person pulls out? They lose the deposit, or they have to buy the property?
After cooling off or before?
After cooling off.
After cooling off, again, it becomes a bit more difficult. So if you decide, technically the contract says you must settle within 6 weeks of signing the contract.
Sure.
If within those 6 weeks you want to pull out for whatever reason, and it's not based on death or incapacity, then there is going to be a penalty. So the vendor would need to relist the property, they need to cut their losses. If you bought it for $1 million, but they could only sell it thereafter for $900,000, they can potentially come and chase you for the shortfall.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's an expensive mistake to make.
Yeah. Someone must be careful before they buy a property.
Yeah,
so speak to a lawyer.
Have to speak to a lawyer. We're friendly.
I got a question that just came in from an audience member. It's saying, what is a 66W? And they're also asking, are real estate agents allowed to make it a requirement before accepting an offer?
Okay, a 66W certificate is a certificate issued by a solicitor for their client, which actually waives the requirement of having a 5-day cooling off period. So if the vendor says, look, I've got 5 people wanting this property, I'll sell it to you, but you need to give me a 66W certificate, which means the day you sign it is the day you're bound by the contract to complete it. So you don't have any cooling off rights.
Sure.
Usually that's required where a property is going for auction in the next week, and they need to make sure that you don't exchange on the contract and then after the auction date you decide to pull out. So 66W is generally required if the property is up for auction, but you're buying it before auction.
Okay. I got another question from an audience member. They're asking, should we get a prenuptial if one party puts more into the property than the other?
That's an interesting question. It's a very interesting question. Prenuptials in Australia haven't really been part of our legal scene for a while. It's very popular in America. In Australia, we have a similar concept to a prenuptial, which is an agreement between the two parties that says, in the event that we split up after we get married, these are my assets, these are your assets, and whatever we've bought together, we're going to split in a particular way. So the prenup in Australia is a bit different to the way the Americans do it. But I mean, it comes down to whether you really want to have that discussion before you get married. So you're talking about splitting up when you haven't even tied the knot yet. So if you really wanted to do that, you could, if both parties are agreeable and they both sign. Both parties need to get their own independent legal advice before signing that document. But having said that, that document could always be challenged down the track. So even if you've put down 50% of 90% of the deposit, and your future wife's put down 10% of the deposit for argument's sake, and you've signed that we get this back at the end of the day, if things go sour, that can still be challenged in court.
Sure.
So it's not binding. In America, it's binding. So whatever you put in the prenup, you have to follow. In Australia, it's a bit more fluid, so it's still open to challenge.
Okay. So I've got a question relating caveat. What is a caveat?
A caveat is an instrument that you lodge on the title of the property, which basically records an interest in the property. So if you've gone to a secondary mortgage lender or you've got debts outstanding on your business, that person can actually put a caveat on your title, which shows other prospective buyers of that property or people who want to deal in that property like banks that someone else has an interest in this property. And that caveat, it's a serious thing obviously to put a caveat on somebody's property, and that caveat basically tells the world that you have an interest. That caveat can disappear either over time, it can lapse, you can go to court and get a court order to remove the caveat, or there can be an agreement between the parties to remove it.
Sure. So it's always important to check the contract to see if it's got a caveat.
Look, I would never encourage someone to purchase a property if on the certificate of title it shows that there's a caveat on the property. You would make it a condition of settlement that caveat must be removed.
Yeah.
And in situations where we see caveats on properties as well, is where there's a family dispute, there's a divorce, one party wants to protect their interest in the house if they're not noted on the title, so they put a caveat.
Okay.
So automatically for a solicitor it rings alarm bells.
Sure. I've got a question that came in from an audience member. They're asking, can I buy a property without engaging a solicitor?
Well, the answer is yes. The answer is yes. There are conveyancers out there. There are registered conveyancers who can actually do the same thing. So they can actually review your contracts. They can undertake the negotiation. They can go through the relevant process through to settlement. So you don't need to go to a solicitor per se for a settlement.
How about if you want to do it on your own?
If you want to do it on your own and you know what you're doing.
I think that's where this audience member is coming.
Look, if you know what you're doing, of course. So if you know how a settlement works, how to negotiate the contracts, what your rights are if things go wrong, go for it. If it doesn't work, then I'm sure you're going to be seeing a solicitor after that.
Okay. I got a question. If you buy a property under the strata scheme, so not Torrens title, strata, what do you actually own?
We did have this discussion earlier. So strata is an interesting concept. Strata, for the viewers who don't understand the concept, they're just units. So when you're buying units, you're not buying land, you're actually buying strata. So what you're actually buying is not land. You're buying the air above the land. So if you're buying unit number 15, which is on level 4 of the unit block, you're essentially buying the piece of air, which is that particular unit that you've purchased. So you don't actually own the land. So what that means is you can't dictate what happens to the land. You don't even have control of the building itself. There's a strata body corporate that's responsible for maintaining the building, making sure it looks presentable, that the bins are put out. They've got their own bylaws. They issue levies. So you can't really even control what happens to the common property of the buildings.
So let's talk about townhouses where you have your own backyard. So if it's under the strata scheme, you're saying you don't own your backyard?
Technically, no.
So your neighbour can pull down your fence
Technically, yes.
and play in your backyard?
Technically, yes. So in some councils in Sydney, for example, they don't subdivide a land using the Torrens title system. So they won't allow you to subdivide the land using Torrens title. They say, look, if you're going to subdivide this land, we'll give you strata rights. Which is an odd thing, if you think about it, because you're actually buying a townhouse with a backyard with a fence down the middle. So technically that's, you own the land. But according to strata law, you don't actually own the land, you just own the air above that land. When you buy Torrens title, you're buying the land, and if you go back to the old case law, you're buying the land all the way down to the core of the earth is yours, and all the air up into the sky is yours, technically. But strata is just, it's an odd concept.
Yeah. But with Torrens,
It's
like
all
you
yours.
said, you own the
Down to the
core of the
core,
earth.
yeah.
But if you find gold in your property,
Good luck.
I heard that the Queen claims it. Like if you find gold or treasure, you have to turn it in because technically it's owned by the Queen.
Yes and no. I mean, if you find treasure in your backyard, if you've bought an old house, you know, and the lady who passed away, who was living there, had stashed all the cash underneath the bottom of the house, and you find it, technically it's yours. You can hand it in, but
Why would you? Okay, I got one final question for you for tonight's show. If you're going to give advice to the viewers out there who want to buy or who want to sell, what advice would you give them?
look, if you want to buy property, you need to do your homework. You really do. I mean, as I said earlier on, the most important thing is you've got to have the deposit. Make sure you've got the deposit. Make sure you've got the stamp duty money ready, which is about 3%. Make sure you've got your solicitor to go through the terms of the contract. And you've got to remember that contracts are negotiable. So if there are terms in the contract that you're not happy with, you don't want a 6-week settlement, you want a 5-month settlement. You can try and negotiate that term into the contract. And you've got to make sure that you're patient. Don't overstretch yourself on the mortgage side of it. You need to make sure that when you do enter into a mortgage, that you can service that mortgage comfortably. If you're living in the property and you're not renting it, you're not negative gearing the property, and you do have excess money to do other things that you want to do, like go on holidays, buy a car. So you just need to be very careful and cautious about how you approach the property.
Okay. I'd like to thank you for your time and for having me on the show.
Thank you.
It's
My
been
pleasure.
a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank
And
you.
thank you for the audience for tuning in today's show. I hope you benefit something from today. Just update for next week's show. The topic is staying pure, specifically before marriage. A lot of people out there who live in the Western societies will blame the Western society and say, how can we stay pure where all this is happening around us? We're being influenced by our colleagues, by media. So tune in to next week's show because we're going to talk about how to stay pure in this Western society that we live in. So the phone number is 0416 551 292. Tune in to next week's show. Thank you for tuning in to tonight's show. I'm Mina Ibrahim from your CYC studios in Sydney. Good night and God bless.
CYC, Christian Youth Channel.